It's good to be in events like this because you don't have to recognize politicians and members of the cabinet. Good morning to all CEOs. I used to be a CEO before and used to be a chief finance officer prior to joining government. And joining government is really a sacrifice for at least some of us or many of us who left the private sector to join President Duterte in his quest to do a lot of changes in government and how government should be run. In the case of Boracay, and I do hope everybody has taken their snacks because we're going to talk about a lot of fecal coliforms, algal blue. Well, everything started in one of the cabinet meetings in February of this year. In that cabinet meeting, it was quite unusual that it was Secretary Juan Ateneo of the Department of Tourism who presented to the cabinet the current state of environmental situation in Boracay. And she was able to deliver that short video to the cabinet primarily because what prompted her was the flooding that happened when Panay was hit by a typhoon in December of 2017. If you remember, Obuha typhoon hit the Panay Island, and it was quite unusual that in Boracay Island, which is a separate island altogether, had flooding up to neck high. So the flooding was up to that level, and in fact, the municipality of Malay is until now under a state of calamity due to the typhoon. So from December of this year, it was under a state of calamity. It's still undergoing rehabilitation due to the typhoon. And it was quite unusual that people started to complain because of the environmental degradation happening in the island. When Secretary Juan Ateneo and the DNR Secretary Lloyd Simato went there mid of January, they were able to document a lot of things in the island. And one of the worst things that they were able to document was the outage, the drainage outage in Bulabog Beach, to which they were able to see some, not some, but a bulk of discharge or black water discharging from the drainage. And it is to the interest of the Department of Tourism to keep Boracay open. One, because it was able to generate 1/3 of the tourists of the country. I think 2 million visitors went to Boracay in 2017, and which generated gross receipts of close to 56 billion. So it is always the interest of the Department of Tourism to keep it open. However, the same agency who's supposed to keep it open is also the same agency who wants it closed temporarily. Primarily because what we saw in the island is that it may not be able to sustain its being the pristine tourist destination of the country if it will continue, if its environment will continue to be degraded. In fact, if we continue, assuming there is no government intervention in the island, assuming the rate of environmental degradation from 2007 to 2017, we will see Boracay Island as a dead island by 2027. So there's really a need to intervene. And in the initial part of the discussion, and I was at the time, I remember that was the second week of February, was I was asked to head the technical working group to look at the Boracay Island and what to do about it to rehabilitate. Because the order of the President was to rehabilitate it within 6 months from that cabinet meeting in February. The initial proposal from our own Secretary Anne, was to close the island for 60 days. And this is the reason why we had to put up a technical working group. And when the technical working group was put up, we were all in agreement that for the island to heal itself naturally, we really need to close it away from the very cause of its environmental degradation, which is the tourists. I mean, there's a conflict. We say the tourists should come in, then we say the tourist goes out. But everything was left unchecked for at least 2 decades. And I'll tell you those stories, which we were able to discover along the way since February. So from that time on, when there was a proposal to close the island for 60 days, the first thing in my mind was how to protect the people in the island who will be losing their earnings, especially the small ones. And this is the reason why, looking at the exact situation of Boracay Island, I propose to put the island under a state of calamity. Because it is only under a state of calamity where we can fast-track the rehabilitation. Under normal circumstances, since the island needs to procure certain infrastructure to be able to redo and rehabilitate the drainage system, the road system, including that of demolishing certain structures or illegal structures, we will not be able to do it under normal circumstances. If the island is to be declared under a state of calamity, we can procure and bring in infrastructure without need of undertaking the usual government procurement process. And to that, we can undertake what we call negotiated bidding to bring in the necessary infrastructure. What is the current state of the environment in Boracay? For 24 straight months, the water discharge in Bulabog Beach has always been, the status has always been failed for 24 consecutive months. The latest was in the second week of March, where the DNR Secretary Roy Simato reported to the Interagency Task Force that the water that comes out, or the fecal coliform counted in the Bulabog Beach, the standard is supposed to be 100 mpn for every 100 ml. 400 mpn for every 100 ml. That's the standard. The latest, or at the time when they took or evaluated the water discharge, the second week of March, it was 18,000 mnn for every 100 ml. 45 times failed in terms of water standards, in terms of outage. That's number one. Number two, if you look at the island, it has no longer been practicing the usual what we call segregation of waste. And they don't even have a materials recovery facility. So what has happened? If you look at the garbage in the island, you now see a smoky mountain. And as the term Secretary Ateneo was saying, it's a smoky mountain with a beach. Because right now, on the average, the island generates between 90 to 115 metric tons of garbage a day. And the local government is only able to haul out 30 metric tons outside of the island. So we're talking about at least 60 to 85 tons of garbage left in the island. And erosion has started to come into the picture, specifically because the garbage is actually near one of the edges of the island. These are just the environmental side. Now, let's talk about the violations of the so-called establishments, the resorts and hotels. Okay? There were around 190 plus or minus establishments which were given notices that they violated certain environmental standards. There are 102 establishments which were violative of the 25 plus 5 meter easement rule. This is 30 meters from the shoreline. There are around 948 illegal structures put up in forest lands and wetlands. So in other words, what we're saying simply is that the island is now in a state of what we call wild, wild west. When the businessmen, when government, when workers, they have not cared about the island. It's a wild, wild west because nobody's following what is established by law. And for many decades, that has been happening. In fact, one businessman, which was interviewed by one of the media outlets, mentioned in that interview, here in Boracay, you first put up the structure before you apply for a permit, quote unquote. Well, unfortunately for that businessman, his resort, which is West Cove, which is the mother of all violators in the island, is now closed down and it's half demolished as of today. That's political will for you, because a lot of administration or a number of mayors or the environment secretary have attempted to close that resort, but it's only now under the term of President Duterte which we're able to do that. They have no environmental permits, no environmental clearance certificate, there's no environmental impact assessment, and it's built in a no-build zone at the edge of the island. So it's really the mother of all violators. Now we've already closed it down. Because the words from the people in the island says, if you can close down that resort, then most of the businessmen will just follow. And as of today, with regard to that violations of the 25+5 easement rule, many of the businessmen that I've talked to, in fairness to them, have said that they will follow and they will self-demolish the violations of these structures. But they will have to start doing it only after April 26. It's quite understandable because they wanted to still take advantage of the few more days that the island will remain open to tourists. So we simply told them that they have to do the self-demolishing so that they can maintain or at least control the aesthetic side of their establishment. Because once government starts to come in and does the demolishing, the government will just demolish it and will not really look at whether it's still beautiful or not. So they have agreed, or some of them have agreed to do the self-demolition. Now, what are we talking about here? First, for purposes of clarification, government is not shutting down arbitrarily the business establishments. Because before you close a business establishment, there should be due process. And we're not doing that. What we're trying to do right now is to close the island from a market. The market that is, at least we call one of the causes why it's happening right now in Boracay Island. In 2008, the carrying capacity of the island, based on the study made by the DNR, is around 30,000. At some point, Boracay has a daily population, both resident and non-resident, of an average of 50 to 60,000 a day. Usually during summers, it would even reach 100,000 a day. And just imagine the amount of garbage and waste that they generate on a daily basis. Next week was supposed to be the regular Lake Boracay event, no? in Boracay. Usually that's the week of May 1. And they were saying that at any time at one point, aside from the 32,000 residents of the island, it can more than 50 to 60,000 tourists go within that week. So we're talking about 80 to 90,000 people every day for 7 days had that Lake Boracay pushed through next week. And because of the limitations of the discharge areas, there are common stories that I have received from different people that if they want to discharge, make some water discharge, they go to the shallow waters of the beach. And if it's solid discharge, they go further afar from the shorelines. And these are actual situations. Just imagine what would happen had that Lake Boracay continued for next week. It would be horrifying in terms of environmental degradation of the island. Right now, the situation is at Culabog Beach, where there is kite surfing. There were several documentations of foreigners who had little wounds, in their skin, and after being exposed to the water in that area for at least 10 hours, those wounds became bigger and got worse. For those in the white beach in front, while it is common that there are algae or algal bloom that comes into the seashore every summer, the Bureau of Fire and Aquatic Resources has mentioned that the volume of algal bloom is quite heavy, considering the fact that this is summer. The volume, in fact, if you go there, you'll see every morning tons of algal bloom or algae that is being washed out on the seashore. And then, in other words, if the water is quite clear, sometimes in the early morning or late afternoon, you'll see the water, specifically in the seashore, to be very green, full of algal bloom. So this is quite unusual because algae comes only to the picture if there is high level of phosphate in the water. And this is the reason why there's a heavy volume of algal bloom, because of the phosphate being generated by the island. And you know where phosphate comes from. So these are the situations we have to address right now. We are looking at the island in its totality as a premier tourist destination of the country. Boracay is one of the top 3 beaches in the world, this as declared for 2 or 3 straight years. 10 years from now, it won't be if government will intervene now. Please do not think for a minute that we never sought or listened to the calls of many businessmen in the island for a phase closure. We did consider that, the phase closure. But if we do the phase closure, we will never be able to rehabilitate the island. Because if we're talking about 30,000 tourists who comes into the island and we close one station, there are still 20,000 tourists who will go to the island and generate garbage and waste. And once we're done with phase 1, we're going to open it and close phase 2, then the same tourists will just move to phase 1. So we will end up not rehabilitating the island at all. Until it reaches 2022, the island will never be rehabilitated and will continue to degrade itself in terms of environment. That's why it's very important that we close the island. I've been in corporate rehabilitation for the last 20 years. In 20 years, in corporate rehabilitation, you cannot rehabilitate until and unless you accept that there's a crisis. And I tell you, Boracay is in crisis right now. And that's what I've been telling the people when I went there. Let's accept that there's a crisis. Because once we accept that there's a crisis, now we can start rehabilitating the island altogether. The problem of Boracay as a mini-state, as I see it, is it has a failed governance over the years. What is failed governance? It's not merely a failure of government. It's the failure of everybody. Failure of government, failure of businessmen, failure of workers, failure of residents. All of them should be at fault on what had happened to Boracay Island right now. That is why it is also the interest of everybody to hold hands, to be together in rehabilitating the island itself. When I went there last week, I appealed to the people not to resist government's intervention in rehabilitating the island. The close for 6 months, the closure for the islands is only very temporary for 6 months. In my own estimates, when I did some pencil pushing, some of the programs that we're going to undertake during the 6-month period of closure is already being undertaken right now. For instance, some of the drainage toward the Bulabog Beach is now being rehabilitated by TIEZA, which is the Tourism Infrastructure and Enterprise Zoning Authority. the Department of Public Works has said that they will be able to expand the road network and redo the drainage system, improve on it within 6 months. So we already have our own plans of action, we already have our own milestones, so that we will be able to open the island, a soft opening, earlier than 6 months. It is to nobody's interest that the island continue to be closed for 6 months. It is everybody's interest for us to be able to fast-track the rehabilitation of the island. As I mentioned in my pencil pushing, if we hit all the milestones that we've identified, we may be able to have a soft opening of the island on the 3rd or 4th month. We're talking about 30 straight days that the water output should be within the NR standards. We're talking about 100% infrastructures violating the 25+5 rule already demolished. We're talking about zeroing out the solid waste in the island. We're talking about making sure that 70% of the road widening project in the island will be finished. If you've been in the island, the traffic there is really terrible. So we're looking at the island in its totality, returning it to its pristine stature. Whether we will be able to return it to that within 6 months, that's a totally different story. But what is for sure is we will make sure that environment-wise, it must return to its regular status, making sure that the water that comes out are regular, are within standards, that there is no more waste, and we'll be able to manage the waste in the island properly. We are now appealing to the businessmen to support us. And as of last week, we've been getting support from many of the businessmen in the area. I'm sure many of you have been complaining about the business side of the issue. I was telling them, in fact, for the big resorts and hotels, they've already made their millions and billions in that island, using the beauty of that island. Many of them who claim to be compliant are actually non-compliant. We have several establishments who've been shouting from the very beginning, we are compliant. Then 10, 15 days ago, we closed them because they don't have a sanitary permit, they don't have a sewage treatment plant. That's why part of the program that we will be doing is one by one, we will inspect all establishments in terms of documentation, whether they have environmental compliance certificate, whether they have the necessary local certificates, or whether they have the necessary facility for purposes of addressing the pollution side. You know, every day in Boracay is always a new day because every day we discover a lot of new things. 3 weeks back, we found out that there were a lot of establishments which are force pumping their wastewater in the drainage. Last Friday, Secretary Simato mentioned that in the course of their inspection, I think a number of very big establishments, including a large convention center, is also force pumping their wastewater directly untreated to the drainage. Now tell me, is there a problem in Boracay? Is there a crisis? Yes, there is a crisis. Again, because of failure of governance. It's everybody's fault. That's why everybody should come into the picture and help us rehabilitate the island. This is our role. We have to make sure that we will be successful in this. That's why the appeal is there. The time is quite limited. Maybe I can entertain questions later on if it's open. But there are a lot of stories I can tell you about the island. But at the end of the day, the ultimate objective is to help the people in the island, making sure business continues to abound, making sure that people make money or earn a living in that island. I would think that the poverty incidence in the island is less than 10%. And if you continue to operate the island, it will be better moving forward. A lot of establishments are really connected to the island right now, whether they are within Boracay or outside Boracay. It is to everybody's interest to keep Boracay open. It is also to our interest. Mind you, this is not an issue of whether we want the island to be closed or open. We want the island to be open. But it has to be open at the right time and everybody contributing to its betterment so that our grandchildren will be able to grow up and to see the island at its pristine status. At the end of the day, not only if we are able to rehabilitate the island, we will not only be seeing a silver lining at the end, but I assure you, not only silver lining will be shown, but also glows of gold. Thank you very much and good morning. And,